This is a conversation with Irving Fain, CEO of Bowery Farming. Irving, thank you so much for being here today. Could you please just start giving everyone in the audience a quick introduction to yourself, and your story?
Sure. I'm going to make it quick. But I have been an entrepreneur since I was a young kid. So I was 8, 9 years old, kind of hustling around into anything and everything I could find my way into. I lived near a college campus. I would draw pictures with my younger brother and try to sell them to people on the street, which was not a good endeavor. Anyone who knew me when I was young would sort of imagine I would have landed in this place. I think agriculture and farming may throw people a bit for a loop. But I have been working in and around technology for about 20 years now. And I did a quick stint in banking when I graduated. And then I did some venture capital investing and kind of jumped in to start something of my own. I actually went to work with Clear Channel, which is now called iHeartMedia. It's the largest radio group in the world. And when I joined, we were part of a small team figuring out what was digital going to mean for this old school radio company. And this seems a little horrifying, but this was like when Friendster and MySpace was still around, and Facebook was page-based and not a feed. And so it sort of started out widgetizing and sharing content. And then the iPhone came out, and I ended up building and running iHeartRadio, which was an awesome experience. If I'd wanted to be an entrepreneur, it would have been a great place to stay. But I've been working on the side 3-4 nights a week with a buddy, kicking tires with different ideas. And so I left to start an enterprise software business, a company called CrowdTwist. It was in loyalty and analytics, focused on CPG companies, retail. And we ended up selling that to Oracle. And I sort of looked out for what I wanted to do next. And what was really important to me was I wanted to work on something where I have a real personal passion. I think I discovered in my last business that I was excited about building and creating something, but not as excited about what I was building and creating, and having both those pieces together is pretty important. And I also wanted to solve an important, broader cultural societal problem. I wanted to work on a problem that was bigger and larger than just simply returning dollars to the folks on my cap table. And so I spent quite some time looking at various sets of industries, and particularly started to look at agriculture and sort of talk about Bowery, and that sort of led me to where I am today.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for keeping it brief. So Bowery is the largest vertical farming company in the United States, and it's been doing innovative work in the food and agriculture space. Could you please just give us a background on Bowery and as well on vertical farming for those in the audience?
Absolutely. So I'll talk about what we do at Bowery in general. And so Bowery is part of a broader movement around indoor farming. Some people call it controlled environmental agriculture. And so the idea is essentially, how do you bring agriculture indoors so that it can be protected from some of the elements outside? It can be more consistent, and ideally it's more sustainable, more surety of supply. We are leveraging a number of different technological trends. We do what's called indoor vertical farming. And so at Bowery, we build smart warehouse scale growing environments. And so we stack our crops from the floor to the ceiling. We grow under lights that mimic the spectrum of the sun, and we grow in a totally controlled and contained environment. So we can grow 365 days of the year, independent of weather, independent of seasonality. So it's reliable, consistent supply of high quality fresh food year round. Additionally, it's completely pesticide-free, completely agrochemical-free food. So it is as pure and clean as you can find from a produce perspective. And whereas in the field, that hurts your quality and your yield, in our case, our produce, and you can get it in this area. So if people haven't tried it, I hope you do. It is the purest expression of what produce can be. And from a productivity perspective, we grow more than twice as fast as the field. We get more crop cycles a year in the field, and we get more yield out of every crop cycle. So we're vastly more productive than outdoor farmland, and we use a tiny fraction of water. And if I sort of step back, what we're really doing is we're using technology to reinvent and reimagine the fresh food supply chain. And we're creating a simpler supply chain, a safer supply chain. We're creating much more surety of supply, and ultimately a much more sustainable supply chain. And we do that by taking today's supply chain, thousands of miles, weeks or months of time, and many, many different players along the way. And so waste and inefficiency, and we collapse it down into a building, and we locate that building essentially anywhere in the world that we want. It can be next to a customer, it can be next to a distribution center, it can be next to a producer. And so decoupling agriculture from the vagaries and the inconsistencies of outdoors is a powerful and important opportunity moving forward.
You mentioned in your introduction that farming for some might have come as a shock to agriculture. You've had no previous experience in the farming or vertical farming space. So what really attracted you to it? And what made you recognize that need and opportunity there? And what steps did you take to go about kind of exploring that option?
So I think there's a few things. Like, first of all, I like doing hard shit. And I had built an enterprise software company, which was interesting, and I recognized that I could build another enterprise software company. I sort of understood the playbook of what it was required, and as I took a step back and looked at sort of the world we're living in, an enormous amount of our economy exists in the real world. It exists in products we touch and feel. It exists in manufacturing and factories and buildings and things like that. And the notion that we can sort of evolve and solve world problems simply through software and consumer applications is just sort of factually not true. And I was really interested in trying to think about and tackle some of these different real world problems. And I think fortunately at that time in the capital cycle, there was an appetite and an interest from a capital perspective to finance opportunities and bets like that in a way that had been different sort of 10 years prior to that, when a lot of venture was more focused at that point in consumer applications and software applications. And so I started looking around, and I started looking at agriculture. And it's the oldest and the largest industry in the world. It's the largest consumer of resources globally by quite a wide margin. And we have a situation where the world around us, clearly from a climate perspective, I mean, you couldn't have sort of scripted it, but I mean, it's 70 degrees outside right now. I called my wife, and she's like, "That's terrifying." And I said, "I kind of agree." I mean, it's nice for all of us to walk outside and it be 70, but it shouldn't be 70 degrees. And the reality is there's just a lot more uncertainties and instability, and that doesn't even count for geopolitics and some of the other issues we deal with. And agriculture is subjected to that in a pretty substantial way. There's lots more people that are going to be living in this world in the coming years. There's a need for more and different types of food. And how we're going to provide that more efficiently and more sustainably in new ways is not only an interesting opportunity, but I would call it a critically important opportunity that's often overlooked, particularly in food and agriculture, just how we need to evolve that system alongside systems like energy, alongside systems like transportation, which also need to be evolved from a climate and carbon perspective.
Awesome, thank you. You've given us a bit of insight into why Bowery and where this idea came and kind of the steps you took. And since then, Bowery has really emerged as a leader in the vertical farming space. Can you talk to us a bit about why that is, what steps you took once founding it, identifying that opportunity to grow and to really cement yourselves, and also what can you do to continue to foster and promote entrepreneurship in the space?
So listen, I'm a firm believer. One of my favorite quotes I use all the time is "Luck is when opportunity meets preparation." So I think everyone wants to imagine there's sort of a genius that navigated the whole thing in a certain way. And so I think you have to be prepared. You have to find the opportunities, and hopefully things unfold. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Candidly, we took a very thoughtful approach to scaling the business. So I need to step back further. Your job as a founder, in a lot of ways, is to take a look at what problem you're trying to solve, and then as effectively as you can identify what are the key areas of expertise and understanding that I need to have around me to solve that. Where am I strong? Where are there gaps, and how do I fill them in? So that was really the starting point, because this is an ambitious endeavor in the sense that it requires agricultural experience, engineering experience, operational experience, clearly financial experience. Because we're building a brand around our products. There's a marketing component to this, and so ensuring that we had the right folks in the beginning was important. And then secondly, we tried to really approach this from an intellectually honest first principle standpoint. First of all, just to say, could this be done in a scalable way to start? Could you actually build something that could scale? Because I'm a believer, if you can create an economic engine that by virtue of functioning drives impact, you can create exponentially more impact than NGOs and nonprofits even, which isn't to say that there's anything wrong with NGOs and nonprofits. It's just a different and what I would say a very effective way to drive change. And so we wanted to see, could you build a business that scaled? You're never going to know for certain, but we spent a lot of time openly looking at could that be done and how. And once we gained some conviction that our approach made sense, we started small, we iterated, we optimized, we got larger, we iterated and optimized. And that's particularly important in a world of physical assets, capital expenditures, et cetera, where you can't refactor an asset the way you can code overnight. And so being thoughtful and having the humility to recognize you're going to make mistakes, you're going to have errors, and then adjusting and changing as quickly and best you can. That certainly, I think, provides some aspect of why we are where we are today.
And you just touched on there the need to always be adjusting and changing. And for those who follow the indoor agriculture space, they know that this last year has been a really tough one. How do you see the future playing out?
Yeah, I mean, listen, last year was tough probably for everyone in the late stage environment the last 18 months, and it was particularly tough in, I'd say, our industry, but more broadly, it was tough in food and agriculture in general. I think there was a pretty sharp correction from people willing to take longer duration risk, to take longer, larger term capital risk, to a reversion back to kind of the bread and butter of what venture capital has been for a long time. Enterprise software, particularly, kind of the one outside component of that is what you're seeing in sort of Gen AI and the AI side and related industries. And, you know, like unquestionably, what we're doing, like, there's not a playbook. I can't point to 20 big companies out in the public markets who've done this already, and we're doing it slightly different. And there's a lot of other industries. I mean, if you look at cellular agriculture, cultivated meat, they've had sort of the same thing, and seafood, the same ideas. You look at some of the fermentation companies. There's a lot of folks in food and agriculture who I've got enormous respect for, who are pushing the boundaries to try to think about what's next. And there was a pretty substantial correction. And the two things I'd say is you got to be careful to pay too much attention to the press. And that's a two-sided coin, though, because it feels real good when people write stories about how amazing you are. This is the next greatest thing, and this is going to take over the world. And you got to be really cautious to not believe in that. And simultaneously, you've got to be cautious when you read the stories of, oh, this is never going to happen. Because the only thing the press likes more than long live the king is the king is dead story. And so you got to kind of watch both sides of it. And there's been a turning, I'd say, as some of these food and agriculture companies, and even beyond, you know, some of these space companies even have struggled to say that none of this stuff works. And the truth is that's not true. And in fact, industry change and real systemic change, particularly in long-term incumbency-based industries, takes time. And when you're dealing with physical assets particularly, it takes even more time. And I look at two great examples. Number one, more near in. Like, look at what happened in rideshare. And look at in the mid-2000s. I mean, some people here may remember, of course, it was Uber and Lyft, but there were dozens of other companies who were doing this. And they started failing. They started merging. And people looked at it and said, oh, ride sharing is a joke. It's never going to be an industry. We told you this was never going to work. Fast forward today, Uber's having kind of its best quarters that they've ever had. They had their best fiscal year last year. And these are substantial, legitimate big businesses. Even more so, go look to the early 20th century when there were 1,000+ automotive companies. And people looked at this, and the automotive companies were failing, and brands were failing. People said, I told you the car was ridiculous. We just need a faster horse. And there's never going to be an automobile. And you know, I got here in a car. I'm sure many of you have driven in cars in the last couple of days. So I'd say cars are a pretty substantial portion of our economy. And so, you know, I think you've got to adjust your aperture a little bit depending upon what you're doing. And back to your question, like what we're seeing in our industry is in many ways the natural evolution of an industry as it's growing and maturing. And I actually look at it as a net positive because the tailwinds and the mandate around what we're doing is important in there. But there's somewhat of a rationalization as the industry grows up. And it needs to grow up if it's going to be grown up.
And so we talked about industry difficulties and challenges. But there's also just been a global scale issues in the last couple of years. We're facing a historic multi-year drought, and with, in fact, 2023 being the hottest year on record, and farmers are managing water in preparation for extremes. We've also seen inflation of food prices of nearly 3% this year and expected to continue the same in 2024. How can vertical farming really help future-proof, you know, the industry and future-proof this for the world?
The first thing I would just say is, like, I am not a believer in trumpeting, you know, one industry, let alone one company, as solving global problems like food and climate. So this is about a portfolio and a myriad of set of solutions, well beyond Bowery. And I want to see more and more people get involved in these industries because we need smart people like, you know, the people in this building and beyond thinking about these problems. But what is definitive is that we are in a much more unstable period in our future. Currently right now, but in the future ahead. And that's climatically. I mean, you just look at what's going on in the Suez Canal, which is geopolitically driven. You look at what's going on in the Panama Canal, which is climatically driven. You look at what you pointed out, you know, the challenges in drought. I mean, the aquifer situation in the United States is legitimately a challenging situation. And we've lost in the last 20 years in California about, I'm going to get the stat wrong, but basically it's 1.3 times the size of Lake Mead. Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the country. So we've lost that much water in our core aquifers. And aquifers take a long time to replace. And so we've just, and this is not just a U.S. problem. This is all over the world right now. And so you've got instability and uncertainty. And you've got people and populations which are changing and growing, and developing countries which get more wealth move from cereal grains to wanting fresh produce and meat. And both of those two food groups have real climatic impacts. I mean, there's some folks coming on who are going to talk about meat in a little bit, which is a hugely important challenge that we need to solve. I think people just think of the meat side, but you actually have to focus on the whole upstream component of it as well, which goes into feeding the actual animals. And so we're just facing a critically important moment. And the stat that I like to point out, so everybody seems to talk about energy and transportation, and those are very important. But from a global greenhouse perspective, energy and transportation are essentially on par with food and agriculture. They essentially contribute the same amount of greenhouse gases annually. And if you were to look at a gigaton of CO2 produced in 2022, there was about $51 billion invested in decarbonizing energy and transport. The same actual metric for agriculture was about $2.5 billion. So it's about 20 times difference in investment between energy and transportation and food and ag. And yet they're essentially equal contributors. And so we really desperately need more innovation in this sector from a number of areas. And so what we're doing is important because it's not just about mitigation of climate impacts in the future. It's also about climate adaptation and the ability to more consistently and reliably grow food in more places as the climate around us and the world around us is unfortunately just less consistent and less reliable.
And just building off that point, how can we, be it the U.S., other governments, or other companies, in fact, incentivize further innovation in the space and really, create more of this entrepreneurial environment to really push forward and solve some of these issues that you just touched on?
Hey, we're sitting in the bastion of our government, so hopefully someone in this room can take this back. But in seriousness, particularly the agricultural subsidy system and more broadly kind of the federal support and even the state-based support system in agriculture actually tends to be much more narrowly focused than people sometimes understand. And if you look at what we're doing at Bowery and what's happening in indoor farming in general, this is just a piece of the puzzle. I'll go back to like cultured meat and cell-based meat. I'll go to fermentation. I'll go to a lot of these other technologies. This is infrastructure. It's no different than renewable energy. It's no different than transportation opportunities. It's no different than wireless, telco towers, cable, etc. And if you really take a look at it, food security is national security. And in fact, for a number of the crops that we grow at Bowery, for a long time, we were net exporters. And last year, we were net importers of those crops. And so that tells you something in terms of where we're headed as a country. And so if you look at key infrastructure around the United States, in almost every case, we have supported from a government perspective the rollout of infrastructure. Not paying for the whole thing, but government jumping in and supporting. If it's done in the right way and with the right market-based mechanisms, actually can pull a lot of private capital dollars off the sidelines, and you can end up getting exponentially more dollars from the private sector than you ever get from the public sector, because private sector gets comfort knowing that there's a base and a foundation. And so we need to support. In fact, we're working in DC now on an investment tax credit for technology-driven sustainable agriculture. Indoors, outdoors, doesn't matter. We want to encourage growers of all types to use technology to be more sustainable, and that support's important beyond just the staple crops, the row crops, insurance, all these other components that already exist.
Thank you so much for that. So, I guess just moving further along this point, how do you really see the industry as a whole evolving? Obviously, you've got the deep integration of technology, like you guys at Bowery have with Bowery OS and now AI. How are you building that out? How do you see the industry as a whole adapting that and further building that out? And then what have you guys learned from abroad markets, such as the European market that's got a huge presence in the green economy and things like that?
I'd say you're going to see indoor farming become a much larger presence, not only in this country, but around the world. And you're going to see the crops that are represented by indoor farming much more kind of present across a wider aspect of the produce aisle. So it tends to be generally focused in the leafy greens and herb space today. And people sometimes make the mistake to assume that that's all that can be done. Whereas the truth is this will go broader from a geographic perspective and broader from a product perspective as well. Both those things will certainly happen. I think Europe gets some things right. I'd say Europe gets some things wrong too. So I think there's lots to learn. They've certainly committed to and pushed on the green economy, but candidly, a lot of that comes from the desire of the European consumer, and the U.S. consumer is a different consumer. So for us to expect that same adoption curve, it's probably not going to happen in that exact way. But I certainly hope that thinking about sustainability, climate impact, et cetera, becomes more of a forefront choice in the way we're thinking about just building regulation, thinking about what industries we're supporting, how we're growing, how we're buying, et cetera. Because at the end of the day, like, you all have a lot of power here as individual consumers, because the consumers drive this economy one way or the other. And if people stop buying something and start buying another thing en masse, I can assure you people will stop making the thing people aren't buying and start making more of the things they are.
Yeah, and could we just quickly also dive in deeper into this technology point at Bowery? Obviously, that's what you guys pride yourselves upon with your vertical farming integration. So looking at Bowery OS and your AI integrations, could you tell us about why Bowery has really integrated this AI and this tech into their business, and also what you see the future holding at Bowery for further tech expansion?
I'm a real believer that the opportunity ahead, particularly around physical infrastructure opportunities, is the integration of the real world, real tangible technology and software, sensor controls, AIs, that whole side of the house as well. And so, this has been a part of our thesis from the very early days. And so for us, the Bowery operating system is it's software, it's hardware, it's computer vision and AI, and it's a sensor and control network. And it's the brains and the central nervous system of everything we do. It orchestrates the entire supply chain. It manages our entire growing space. There's no humans at all in our growing space. It all runs autonomously on its own. It manages all of the automation, the equipment across the farm, and it handles all the work management. It handles scheduling, telling our farmers where to go and what to do and when to do it. And anybody who's familiar with any kind of farming operation, just the logistics and the supply chain and the management of that can be pretty difficult and a lot to take in. If you were to see our farms, they're quite complex. And so for humans and labor to sit and do that work would be overwhelmingly inefficient. And so we use technology to create efficiency and drive opportunities in places that candidly you couldn't do it before. I mean, we're taking advantage. Everyone points to LED lighting as the reason indoor farming works. And essentially, NASA was growing food indoors in the 80s. I mean, we're not the first people to do this, even close. The problem, the lights cost too much and they were really inefficient. In about the last 15 years, cost of lights dropped 85% and the efficiency doubled. That was important, but it wasn't sufficient either. And so we're leveraging dropping costs of storing data, dropping costs in terms of running models, handling AI, dropping costs of sensor controls and automation. There's a lot of powerful trends that we can harness to do what we do. And that's why we took a step back and said, hey, in some ways, if you were to build a greenhouse in a different way today, would you still build a greenhouse and just do it differently, or would you do something else? And that's why we landed on what we did.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And I think, Irving, just to wrap it up, many in the audience are fellow undergraduates and aspiring entrepreneurs. What advice would you give to a current college student, and what advice would you give to someone looking to start, a business, especially, in this agriculture space that you're in?
It's such a great world right now if you're a young undergraduate, because there's so much innovation and there's so much entrepreneurship. The first thing I would say is there's a couple things. Building anything is hard. Like, everything is hard. It doesn't matter. If you're going to open a corner grocery store, that shit's hard. I promise you. And so it's all hard. And there's a real advantage because there's so much innovation and opportunity right now. Like, go spend some time at an existing company. And it can be an early stage company, but I'd almost say it's an advantage. There's an advantage to doing something that's a little bit later stage, a little bit more mature, that's figured some things out. Just get a feel for how things work and what's happening there and what you're interested in, and listen, if you have a burning idea, I would never suggest someone doesn't jump in, but there's so much opportunity to learn. And my uncle said to me years ago, he said, why don't you go learn on somebody else's dime? There's so many great opportunities to spend a couple of years doing something else and learning in someone else's business. And then I think when you're ready to go start something, if that's what you want to do, and being certain that that's what you want to do is also important. I think unfortunately the last decade there's been some glamorization and sort of a sensationalized aspect of entrepreneurship, as if it's like, flying around and being hailed for your greatness everywhere. If that's what it is, someone's got to tell me how to get there, because it's a lot of fight and difficulty, and it's actually a lot of time in your own head when no one else is around. And so you've really got to be committed to wanting to do that. And if you are, the last thing I'd say is an acknowledgement that no matter what, entrepreneurship is always about stepping off a cliff. And the question really for you is, how big of a cliff are you stepping off? And so you can do a lot of work, spend a lot of time, de-risk your idea in a substantial way, and you can make that cliff get smaller. But if you think you're going to create flat ground and you're going to just step across, that's never the case. You've got to get comfortable at some point with just walking off. And you got to know that there's always going to be a delta, and just go.
Well, Irving, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much